I'd really like to begin, Robert, first of all, by congratulating you on this wonderful book. It's
Thank you.
a book of many different dimensions and great richness. It's a beautiful, as you'll see already, it's a beautiful book, and it's also a very fascinating way of entry into the history of our city. So it makes contributions to art history, industrial history, family history, because it's in many respects a family book, and a book about the history of Melbourne. So I think its attraction to readers is in this skillful interweaving of many different facets of the story of the Thwaites family. It's, among other things, I think, a contribution to something that I notice as I go into the bookshops as becoming increasingly popular, which we might call the history of things. When I went to readings the other day, you could buy a history of sugar and a history of rubber, and in this instance, it's introducing us to an aspect of the material culture of Melbourne. It reminded me, Robert, of a conversation that I had a long time ago with your father, who was a famous historian, John La Nauze, and he introduced me to Noel Butlin, the economic historian, just as I was beginning the work for my own book called The Rise and Fall of Marvellous Melbourne. And we went to the tea room, and in the midst of the conversation, Noel Butlin turned to me and he said, "Now, are you interested in people or are you interested in things?" And I think I probably said I was interested in people. In retrospect, I realised I was probably more interested in things than I realised at that moment. And in truth, of course, things and people go together. In many respects, things can sometimes speak to us as loudly and eloquently as people. And you say, I noticed in the prologue to your book, Robert, you begin by saying, you quote that famous passage of Ruskin's where he talks about an appreciation of the things of the past in terms of the deep voicefulness, I think is the phrase he uses, about the way they can speak to us. And you quote that and you say at the beginning of your book that what you want to do is to give the furniture of George Thwaites and his family a voice. So I wonder whether you might begin perhaps, first of all, by telling us about how you came to write this book and how you approached that very difficult thing of making objects, things speak to us.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope I've got a home crowd here. I've met for the first time a descendant of Thomas Henry Thwaites, who ran the business for the second half of its life today. So I'm very excited to yet have another link through this book. I just wanted to give Graeme a plug first. He wrote, it wasn't mentioned in the introduction, but he wrote this wonderful book called Lost Relations, which is about his mother's family. And I start to quote from that just because it might generate some discussion. I won't quote for it much. For most of my life, I have avoided family history, was how he says this. And then he goes on and says, but I've come to understand the nuances that they are, and the temptation is to have reminiscences and nostalgia, whereas I don't particularly like family genealogy, but I like the stories that things tell. And I had a meeting with somebody I'll talk about it a bit later, a man called Terence Lane, who was the former senior curator at the NGV. I went to his house, and he has a wonderful house just opposite Newman College in Swanston Street, and everybody will know the house. It's a little house set back, a most wonderful house made by a stonemason who worked in Melbourne General Cemetery. I went in there because Terence Lane knew a little bit about Thwaites, and he had some leads that I might like to follow. And during this conversation, he said to me, and it really frightened the pants off me, he said to me, "Maybe, Rob, you are just the person who will let Thwaites have his moment in the light." And that was really the start of thinking about the furniture as a vehicle for the book.
I mean, you're by profession a chemical engineer, Robert, and engineers have the mind that's trained on things and the material world, don't they? Did that influence you at all in the way you came to this subject, do you think?
Well, I don't know if per se, but I spent my life as a chemical engineer, most of my life as in the research area. And I think the research area was particularly important because it gave me the persistence to follow things down to the not the first layer or the second layer, but the third layer and the fourth layer. And in doing so, I uncovered some stories which were anecdotal, which were untrue when you got down to the base documents. I think that was one aspect of my training as an engineer. The other one is intuition, I think. It's jumping from one thing and wondering why somebody's talking about a particular area or subject matter, and then linking that across the phone.
The family, of course, is not your own family, is it? It's Libby's family. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you've now written 2 books about Libby's family, William, and now. Could you explain a little bit about? I think speaking for myself as a family historian, for most of us, when we write family history, it's because it's our family rather than somebody else's. And the trick, in some ways, is to somehow make that story significant to people other than the immediate family.
Yes, I actually think it not being my family is an advantage.
Yeah.
It is because I then look at this as a work which I want to share with people, and it has to be essentially readable. I did write another book in getting to this one, and those chapters just sit on my computer. They are the normal linear genealogy of the Thwaites family. Bits in England and coming out. I noticed you've got a chapter here about coming out on a ship.
Yeah.
I wrote about that, and then I thought, well, this really wouldn't fly. So
you changed your mind in the process of writing it.
And when I think about it, about why did I want to write it, I go back to my father, and I'm sure we've got Dr. Margison here today, and he remembers my father certainly in an academic sense, quite a severe scholar. But he told me when I was a teenager and moving into the sciences that it was just as important for an engineer to read the works of Shakespeare as it was for a historian to know the laws of thermodynamics. Yes. Well, he knew the laws of thermodynamics, and I haven't read all Shakespeare. But it was.
I never mastered the laws of thermodynamics. So.
Well, I taught it, and I still don't think I mastered it. But that was the sort of background in the family of a scholarly background. But coming to Thwaites was really through Libby's mother, Lorna, who, when we were engaged, had told me that there was an engineer in her family, and that turned out to be William Thwaites. And she talked about William Thwaites with such love and affection, and about George Thwaites and Sons, that I thought there must be something there. And that's 50 years ago, and it took a long while to get to that point, though.
Sometimes a family historian has a rich cache of letters and correspondence and papers and so on to go on, and sometimes you have much less. What kind of deposit of memory was there of the Thwaites family? Because I know that it does include material objects as well as
yes,
some papers.
No, it does. Really, I think in a sense there's very little written material. And when I started to work on William Thwaites, there's an enormous amount about the public work. William Thwaites was the first engineer-in-chief for the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works. And there's a huge amount on the public record of his work. But there was no colour, there was nothing personal. Well, my mother-in-law and now Libby are really the custodians of the family songline. And a box of family papers arrived one day which had just enough colour, enough letters and just enough information to start to write about William Thwaites. And the more I explored this box, the more I understood there was stuff there about George Thwaites and Sons. So that is how. But the real issue, once I published William Thwaites, I had a distant relative of Libby's rang up and said, I think I'm related to you. And I said, well, no, you're not. You're related to Libby. But he put us on to the tool chest belonging to George Thwaites, which is owned by Glenn Rundle, who's a cabinet maker in Kyneton. And once I got to the tool chest, and then I discovered that the Thwaites themselves had amongst them a whole lot of tools. And once you felt these beautiful moulding planes and things, and you'd restored them and polished them and so on. You really started to get the essence of what they were about. Because Thwaites, it was unusual. In the 19th century, there was the Industrial Revolution was going on, and people were moving from hand-based artisans to machines, and George Thwaites and Sons refused to introduce those machines into the workshop, saying that you could not make better furniture than that which you did with your hands. And that's really the why those tools and the furniture actually starts to really get into your psyche.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think people, as they read this book, will enjoy about it is that you come to the subject both with the perspective, if you like, of a connoisseur. You're a painter yourself, and you've got a real appreciation of the aesthetics of this furniture, these beautiful pieces, which we'll see some in a moment. But you also come at it from the vantage point of the craftsman. You're interested, aren't you, in how these things were made, and you tell us, for example, the difficulties that people had when they first came to Australia, used to using European softwoods, when they began to use hardwood. So from my vantage point, I really enjoyed those parts of the book. And you've made, among the illustrations, of course, your own drawings of the tools.
Yes, I think that they must have struggled. I mean, if you get English oak, the hardness of red gum, which was one of the first sort of woods that they started to use, is about twice as hard as oak. Yeah. And so consequently, any planes, you have to adjust the angle of the plane, you have to grind it more often. There's some planes in the collection which have obviously had pieces added so that they could hold a fence added to the side of the plane so that they could hold the plane against the wood. It's interesting also that blackwood, which was very popular, is about the same hardness as oak, but it has high graphite, silica in it, so it dulls the planes very quickly. This is not knowledge that I had when I started, but I've been talking to the cabinet makers and other people about this who work with these woods today.
Yeah. Turning to the other facet of it, which is the aesthetic and stylistic aspect of it, I remember years ago I was kind of brought up to think that the best kind of furniture was classical design or modern design. What we've got here, of course, is high Victorian furniture, isn't it? And it's particularly influenced by the Gothic revival. Would you like to tell us a bit about the way those ideas influenced Thwaites and his family?
Well, Thwaites was a product of the market, I mean, in a sense. The colonials here, really, if you read it, were always looking to England and maybe to France for the latest in fashion, which came very quickly through pattern books, which is one on display there, Blakey and Sons pattern book. And indeed I'll show a slide which compares what Thwaites did. It's a bit of sort of mixing and matching with the patterns and then adding your own little bit of creativity. But I think Thwaites resisted the sort of really excessive Victorian furniture. His work is really basically very well proportioned and beautifully crafted. The Gothic Revival furniture, which there is the most magnificent suite of Gothic Revival furniture, and I have a slide later, is at the University of Melbourne. It's probably one of the greatest set of Gothic Revival furniture in Australia. It's just extraordinarily beautiful.
This is probably a good moment, Rob, for you perhaps to show us a few slides and talk about some of the pieces of furniture. Many of these were discoveries to you, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
so you could perhaps tell us a bit about them.
I'll do that, but I just wanted to quote one of the things is to understand that what happened was in the late 18th century, you have the Sheraton type, very light, beautiful furniture. And then there's a movement as the furniture becomes very heavy, very clunky. Well, Thwaites' furniture, I think, is not of that genre. It's much more subtle. And indeed, Thomas Henry Thwaites was on a judging panel in 1866, the International Colonial exhibition here, and I just thought it was worth reading this, if it's all right. He says, household furniture must above all things be useful and comfortable. In a word, must be perfectly adapted to the particular purpose for which each article is intended. It would be next to absurdity to sacrifice convenience for elegance. And that's what was being done with some of these, George Smith in about 1810 had Gothic sort of motifs on furniture with, legs and wings and all sorts of things. Well, Thwaites is not that sort of person. Do you want to?
Yes, why don't we have a look at some pictures?
I just selected a few bits from the books of different areas of interest. Oh, let me go back. Sorry, it comes too far. This is a picture of a cabinet making workshop in 1813. 1813 is a particularly important year for Thwaites. It's the first year he was a journeyman, that is, he'd finished his apprenticeship. And because he'd finished his apprenticeship, he could marry. So he married in 1813 Elizabeth Wilkinson, a Yorkshire girl. And this painting done in 1813, the year that Jane Austen published Pride and Prejudice, by the way, so to give you an idea of the period of this, is probably almost exactly the same as the type of workshop that Thwaites worked in London. Very typical, the two journeymen there with their square paper hats, and in the background with a leather coat and a leather hat is the master craftsman. And around beside each worker there's their toolbox, and they worked with their toolbox open, and they would put the planes back into that, and they'd try and keep their bench as clear as they needed to for work. So each man is working on a singular piece of furniture there. I think Thwaites' workshop in Melbourne would have been much the same. I don't think that it would have changed a great deal. They probably didn't wear the paper hats and things, but on the other hand, if there's a cartoon in the Punch from the same period, which is of a journeyman with a paper hat, which you can see in the display later. Let's move on. Just to show you, here's the George Thwaites toolbox with the tills, the drawers taken out, and they have the planes in the bottom there, and there's two planes. These ones are stamped on the end George Thwaites Jr. Well, it's George Thwaites, but I've been able to identify they belong to George Thwaites' son George. And they came out with about 5 or 6 toolbox crammed with all they needed to make tools in 1842. And they started more or less immediately. Now in those days, if they had the wood available, it probably took not much more than a day for a cabinet maker to make a chest of drawers. I mean, once they've got the planks and they work so quickly. And really, it's just the front of the furniture that's the best part. The rest of it, I think they have a phrase, they have to show the front to London. In other words, that you don't look behind. I put these in early because these are the earliest known bits of Thwaites' furniture. There's a beautiful blackwood sewing box on the left, 1845 roughly, and there's some furniture which is reputed to be made by George for his own use about the same period. Very simple, elegant furniture. Now, one of the other things for having this, there was quite a demarcation in the cabinet making business. And so the person who would have made the sewing box in London would have been called a fancy cabinet maker. And the person on the right making the chairs and the tables would have been just a cabinet maker, but then in a specialist shop he would have made only chairs or only tables, depending how big the shop was. So I hope that that's clear in the book, because I think people needed to understand the demarcation. And what happened when they came out to the colonies was that, well, you couldn't just specialise in making sewing boxes. You had to be a jack of all trades. In fact, you had to be a carpenter, you had to be a joiner, you had to be a cabinet maker. Otherwise you wouldn't survive.
It's interesting, isn't it? The furniture he made for his own use, as you say, is fairly plain. They were themselves relatively, they were congregationalist, plain living people, weren't they? They're mixing. So I found it very interesting because he must have been meeting the elite of Melbourne, from the governor down. Anybody who was commissioning fine cabinet work probably came to their workshop. But they themselves are people who are, by the end of the period, solid middle class, but by no means of the elite,
yes.
are they?
Upright, law-abiding.
Yes.
But, you know, when you're working 10 hours a day in the workshop, you really haven't got much energy, I suspect, to do any more than that. They had their workshop in Little Collins Street, and they lived above that workshop, which expanded over a period. It's now no longer. It was taken. If you walk down walk up Little Collins Street from Swanston Street, it's where the Victoria Hotel is today. In 1854, when Governor Hotham arrived, Thwaites got the commission to furnish Toorak House, which is the Swedish church today. And these are one of the pieces. Here's a little bit more in line with the higher end of Victorian furniture. But it's just marvellous when you read the symbolism on it. On the top you've got the crown and 2 cornucopia, which represents the fecundity of the new state of Victoria, with grapes and fruit and wheat flowing out from Victoria's magnificent reign. And then on each side on each pedestal you have a crown and the VR, the monogram of Victoria, and that's surrounded by a rose, a shamrock, and the thistle. So it's, you know, this was high end for the Queen's representative in Toorak House. So here's an example. This is a hall chair that the National Gallery have, and here's an example of how the cabinet maker developed their own style based around the patterns required by their clients. So on the right is a pattern, and that's all the cabinet maker got, was a picture like this from Blakey and Sons, 1853. And there are chairs in the Government House today which similar to the one in National Gallery, but a different pattern, demonstrating that very quickly Thwaites was able to get these pattern books and make furniture. This is properly dated at about 1855, and you can see that Thwaites has taken the back and the general pattern, and he's modified it slightly. He's modified the front, probably the request of the client, and he's put different legs on them. And that's all Thwaites' addition or changes to the original pattern. So that's how they're good. You'd come in and you'd look through a pattern book and you'd say, well, I'd like that, and you'd have some dialogue with the cabinet maker to decide what you wanted for your place. This was a Eureka moment for me. This is a watercolour by John North of the great exhibition in 1862 in London. And you can see that pyramid there. The pyramid was meant to represent the amount of gold that had come out from Victoria at that particular time. And in the front here is this extraordinary Gothic Revival display cabinet. Now it's over 5 metres tall, and in it was real gold samples, nuggets and other things. And that was made by George Thwaites and Sons, and was carved by a carver, specialist carver, a man called Daniel Livingston, who worked in conjunction with Thwaites. And that was taken over, and both the pyramid and the gold samples was a sensation in London. So the gold case, I think, was probably destroyed afterwards. I don't know whether it exists at all. Now we get to the university, and these are the Chancellor's chairs, and on the left-hand side there's a chair for the councillors. This was made in 1865 for the University of Melbourne. It was ordered by Redmond Barry. It was designed by Joseph Reed, the architect, probably with Edmund Latrobe Bateman's input, and carved in part by Daniel Livingstone, and the carcasses and other things made by George Thwaites and Sons. There are two tables that go with this. The table itself is over 5 metres long, beautifully with barley twist columns and the like, and if it was put together, it would represent, I think, one of the most glorious Gothic revival suites in Australia. It's currently, it's got modern synthetic cushions and things on it now. The Morocco leather clearly deteriorated. Now we move to Government House. In 1876, Thwaites and another cabinet maker, McEwen, were asked to furnish the state apartments. And I just chose two examples here. This is a part of the bedroom suite made by Thwaites. It's Canadian birch on hewn pine. So it's a Canadian birch veneer with this beautiful patterning in it on hewn pine. And the inlay, the brown you can see around the drawers and the like, is blackwood. Most exquisitely beautiful piece. And part of the suite, there are other parts that are in the same bedroom. Quite a suite. I'll keep moving on, probably taking up too much time. Yeah. Okay, that's a table in Government House. That is actually on the cover, a hard cover of the book. I'm sorry, I've clicked through. It took one cabinet maker a year to make this table and inlay it with various Queensland woods, and I think that it also suggested there's some red gum, I think, in the little crosses in the middle. Finally, I get to this picture here. This was the one that really made me think that I was on the right track. These are 4 state governors. I won't go through them all, but they're sitting on chairs. The two men in the middle are sitting on McEwen chairs from which still exist in the dining room, state dining room in Government House. The 2 outside governors are sitting on Thwaites hall chairs. And I looked at this picture, and just on the left, there's a 5th person in this picture. That's the chair. It is looking out at the camera just as much as the governors. And that was the moment I realised that was the vehicle through which to write the book. Thank you.
In a moment or two, I'm going to invite people to ask some questions. But before I do, I wanted you to have an opportunity to talk a bit about the research and writing of the book. And in particular, I know there's been a warm relationship developed between you and the State Library. Would you like to talk a little bit about all of that?
Well, yes, I would. I think the best way to do it is these 3 pictures here. Thwaites is everywhere when you start to think of it about, particularly in public buildings, although most of the banks, chambers and so on no longer exist, which is a pity. But if you take Governor Henry Barclay out here, and behind you can just see Toorak House. So there is Henry Barclay, Toorak House, and in Toorak House is Thwaites furniture. And here in the library, they've got copies of all Hoskins Papers, which I delved down in, and in doing so, I uncovered what had been an anecdote often repeated, that Hotham, when he arrived, threw out all the Thwaites gaudy furniture and put his own in. Well, the reality is, when you read Hoskins' paper, he did exactly the opposite. He sold his own furniture and was quite comfortable with Thwaites. So there's one example of the depth of the gallery. There are papers here from Redmond Barry's, which I've had access to. Redmond Barry, very particular man, did a catalogue of all his books, and he puts the bookcase on it. So I could figure out how many bookcases he had, and they were all Thwaites bookcases. You can find that from the auction. So there's also Neil Black's papers, which have a catalogue of furniture he bought for Mount Nerat when he furnished Mount Nerat, which is was a country mansion, unfortunately knocked down after the war. George Russell here had Thwaites furniture. George Russell's papers here, the Clyde papers, are here, and they are very useful in tracking down the catalogue of what Thwaites did. And then there's Frederick Sargood here, who was a contemporary of Thomas Henry Thwaites, and both of them sat on the building committee for the independent congregational church here, designed by Joseph Reed, in which Thwaites provided the a desk and two sort of chairs which are still there in the church, probably unrecognised. And there are, I think, two later ones made, but they belong to Thwaites. And Sargood's other thing was that he then went on and built Ripon Lee, which was full of Thwaites furniture. So and there's papers here. The other thing is that the library is the most fantastic collection of early colonial books. So the first people that came back here stayed a few years in the colony, and then went home and wrote an outline of what they saw and did out here, which were extremely useful to get colour for the period.
And also, of course, the partnership with the library has continued on into the publication, because the book has come out, hasn't it, with...
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess the library has been most generous. The most important thing for me was the pictures and the illustrations. We can see it, which are just fantastic. And when you see the book, you'll realise just what a wonderful resource it is.
Been extraordinarily productive in your post-retirement phase. What's next?
I've been dreading this golf. So you get the bug, I think.
Yes.
And as part of being an engineer is I want a project. I want a time-bound, something that's going to have a product at the end.
Yeah. And,
I might turn to my mother and father's family. My mother's family has some very interesting characters in it, from as far back as William Wallace.
Yes.
And then a very interesting character of John Cleland, who wrote Fanny Hill. Yes. Well, I think I might write about John Cleland and Fanny Hill.
Not about your grandfather, because he was a very interesting man too.
My grandfather's somebody's doing that at the moment.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, look, can I first just wind up by thanking Robert particularly for this very interesting discussion that we've had, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the opportunity to mingle with him afterwards.
Thank you.